If I had known that day that politics does not hate bad people, but only despises the naive, I might not have been standing there. I stood in front of the United States Capitol on an early autumn morning, a light wind brushing against the cold marble steps, the American flag flying above my head like a reminder of the ideals I once believed were sacred. At that time, I still thought I was entering a place where law and morality walked hand in hand, where the voice of the people carried weight, where a good person could truly make a difference. I believed that, sincerely and foolishly. Washington, D.C. in the morning looks very different from its image on television. There is no noise, no drama, just clean streets, silent buildings of power, and people walking fast with busy eyes. Capitol Hill appeared before me not as a distant symbol, but as a massive machine running smoothly. I remember taking a deep breath, a sense of pride swelling in my chest, as if I had been granted a privilege not everyone receives. I thought of my father, a former serviceman who taught me that honor is not something to be bargained with. I thought of my mother, a public school teacher who believed that education and law are the two pillars that keep society standing. I entered politics carrying those beliefs. My name is Bryce Hamilton. At that time, I was just a young legislative aide, a name no one remembered, a small cog in the enormous machine called politics. I worked for a congressman I admired, someone who spoke on the media about transparency, accountability, and public service. I believed him. I believed the speeches. I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I kept my integrity, this system would not swallow me whole. I did not understand that the system does not need to swallow people like me. It only needs to erode them slowly. My first conflict did not come from a specific enemy, but from the invisible difference between me and the people around me. I realized that I asked too many questions about right and wrong, while others only asked whether something was beneficial or not. In meetings, I noticed silent exchanges of glances, nods that needed no explanation. I felt like I was speaking a different language, but I convinced myself that it was only a matter of time, that eventually I would understand how things worked without losing myself. In the early days, I worked relentlessly. I stayed late in the office, reviewing every line of draft legislation, analyzing policy impacts, preparing materials for hearings. I believed dedication would be seen. I believed that in a democratic system, effort and morality would be rewarded. I lived by that belief like a flotation device in the open sea, not knowing it was slowly deflating. Then one day I was invited to attend a meeting I never thought I would be part of. It was not an official meeting. There were no minutes, no recording devices, just powerful people sitting around a long table, speaking in tones so calm they were cold. I listened as they discussed an important decision, and I realized that the outcome had been decided before the meeting even began. Law, in that moment, was not a guiding principle, but merely a tool to legitimize a deal already finalized behind another closed door. I felt a chill run down my spine. That was the first peak of disillusionment, though at the time I did not dare admit it. I looked around the room, waiting for a protest, a voice to question morality or responsibility. But there was nothing, only silent agreement. I realized I was the only one who felt uneasy, and that made me doubt myself rather than doubt them. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe this was just an exception. That was the lie I told myself. After that meeting, I did not tell anyone. I returned to my desk and continued my daily work as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. My belief did not disappear immediately, but a small crack had formed within it. I began to realize that my silence was not neutral. It was a choice. And I had chosen silence, not because I agreed, but because I was afraid I did not belong here if I spoke up. I did not know that in that moment, the moment I chose silence in order to survive, I had taken the first step on a path from which I would not be able to turn back. I once thought that if I understood the law deeply enough, I would not lose my way in politics. I believed that knowledge was a shield that could protect me from dirty compromises. But that belief was quickly tested when a bill I had spent weeks researching began to drift away from the path it was meant to follow. On paper, that bill was written to protect vulnerable communities. I read every line, analyzed every impact, and believed it represented what I had come here to pursue. The place where everything began to change was a closed meeting room deep inside the administrative wing of Capitol Hill. There were no large glass windows, no natural light, only thick walls and dim yellow lamps. I sat at the end of the table, listening to conversations not meant for the public. It was there that I first clearly saw the presence of people who held no official titles, yet carried more weight than the legislators themselves. They were lobbyists, corporate lawyers, people who spoke in numbers and interests, not in principles. Eleanor Wright sat across from me. She was a seasoned political advisor who had lived through more terms and crises than I could imagine. Her eyes were calm, her voice low and steady, as if nothing in that room could surprise her anymore. Marcus Reed, a colleague my age, sat nearby. He seemed comfortable, even enthusiastic, as if this environment was his natural habitat. And then Thomas Caldwell entered, the powerful congressman whose name was tied to major legislative victories. When he appeared, the room seemed to adjust automatically to his rhythm. The conflict did not erupt in shouting, but in small edits. I realized that key provisions in the bill were being altered. Sections meant to protect citizens were being softened, while loopholes benefiting large corporations were being subtly expanded. I spoke up, cautiously but clearly, pointing out the legal and ethical risks. I believed that if I spoke correctly, people would listen. I had overestimated the value of being right in that room. Eleanor looked at me for a long moment before responding. She did not refute my argument, nor did she agree with it. She simply said that politics does not operate on the purity of ideas, but on their ability to survive in reality. Marcus leaned toward me and whispered that this was not a battle I should choose. Thomas Caldwell said nothing, but the brief glance he gave me was enough for me to understand that the decision had already been made. My words were acknowledged as a necessary formality, not as something that could change the outcome. The process moved forward without needing my consent. I watched the bill being revised, packaged, and prepared for a vote. Each change seemed reasonable when viewed in isolation, but together, they formed something entirely different from the original intent. I felt as if I were standing at an invisible crossroads. Either I accepted that this was how things worked, or I pushed myself to the margins by resisting to the end. The climax came when I realized that my signature was on the final documents. I had participated in creating the very thing I opposed. No one forced me to sign. No one threatened me. I did it because I believed that if I stayed, I could limit the damage. That was the justification I used to sleep at night. But deep down, I knew I had crossed a line I once swore I would never touch. After the bill passed, there was no applause, no sense of victory, only the cold relief of people who had achieved their objective. I returned to my desk, looked at the stack of papers in front of me, and felt a hollow space I could not name. I began to understand that justice in this place was not the final goal. It was a variable, adjustable to serve other purposes. When I left the building that evening, Washington, D.C. looked as peaceful as ever. Streetlights turned on, traffic moved steadily, and life continued as if nothing had changed. But for me, something had ended. I no longer saw the law as an absolute moral compass. I began to see it as a tool, and the question was no longer what was right, but who would benefit from it. I walked into the night with a heavy feeling, knowing that I had just learned an important lesson, even though I was not yet ready to fully accept it. I was not fired. I was not reprimanded either. There was no warning email, no serious meeting, no threats spoken aloud. Everything happened so quietly that, for a short time, I wondered whether I was imagining the change. But then I realized that I was no longer invited to meetings I had previously attended. Important emails were no longer forwarded to me. Strategic discussions took place elsewhere, with other people. I still sat at the same desk, still completed the tasks assigned to me, but my presence gradually became invisible. The setting did not change. Capitol Hill was still crowded, the hallways still echoed with hurried footsteps, offices still kept their lights on late into the night. But my position within that picture had shifted. I began to notice gaps in my schedule. Mornings that used to be packed with meetings were now strangely empty. I had more time to observe, And it was that observation that made me understand I had been pushed to the margins, not because I did something wrong, but because I had not played the right role. Familiar faces began to avoid my gaze. Marcus Reed, who used to sit beside me in tense meetings, now rarely appeared in my work area. When we crossed paths in the hallway, he offered a polite smile, quick and hollow, and kept walking. Thomas Caldwell almost never mentioned my name anymore. Instructions that once came directly through me were now routed through others. I was not publicly removed. I was made irrelevant. The greatest conflict I faced during that period was not with a specific person, but with my own understanding. I had always believed that if I worked hard and held on to my ethics, the system would at least give me a place. But reality showed that in politics, integrity does not guarantee survival. I stood before an uncomfortable question. Was I being punished for speaking up, or simply because I did not fit the rhythm of this place? I tried to respond in the way I always had. I worked more. I prepared more carefully. I sent detailed analyses and thoughtful notes, hoping their value would be recognized. But those efforts fell into a void. No one responded. No one complained. The prolonged silence made me understand that the problem was not the quality of my work. The problem was that I was no longer considered part of the game. The climax came by chance. One late evening, when I returned to the office to retrieve forgotten documents, I heard a conversation from a meeting room whose door had not been fully closed. I had no intention of eavesdropping, but the words carried clearly enough for me to stop. They mentioned me by name, not with anger, but with cold assessment. He's smart, but too naive. Not suited for politics. Not worth investing in long term. Those words were not spoken loudly, but they carried more weight than any reprimand I had ever received. I stood there, neither entering nor leaving. In that moment, I understood that I was not seen as a threat. I was simply seen as unnecessary. And that hurt far more. I returned to my desk, sat down, and for the first time in many years, I did not know what I was striving for. The ideals that once led me here had grown dim, not because I no longer believed in them, but because I no longer saw a place for them in this reality. After that night, I did not resist. I did not try to justify or defend myself. Instead, I began to be silent in a different way. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of observation. I started to notice who spoke to whom, who avoided whom, who truly made decisions and who merely played the role of spokesperson. I realized that power did not reside with those who spoke the most, but with those who decided what could be said and what would be withheld. When I left the building on a gray afternoon, I felt that I had lost a part of myself. But at the same time, I had gained something else. I no longer held the illusion that I could survive here on righteousness alone. I began to understand that if I wanted to remain, I would have to learn how to become invisible by design. They did not need to expel me. They only needed to make me disappear. And it was within that disappearance that I began to see the true structure of power. The moment I realized I had become invisible, I also understood that this invisibility was not only a punishment, it was an opportunity. When no one expected me to speak anymore, when no one asked for my opinion in major meetings, I gained something I had never had before: time and distance. I was no longer pulled into the frantic rhythm of surface-level decisions. I began to see deeper layers where things were truly decided. During those days, the surroundings did not change. Capitol Hill still operated like a precise machine, but I was no longer standing among the exposed gears. I moved between offices in a muted role, assigned tasks others considered secondary. Those very tasks led me to old files, forgotten notes, emails no one monitored anymore. I began to connect scattered pieces of information, not to resist, but to understand. Eleanor Wright was the first to notice the change in me. One afternoon, she called me into her office, not as an advisor lecturing, but as someone checking what I had learned. She did not ask whether I still believed in ideals. She only asked what I had seen. I answered cautiously, speaking about hidden connections, about decisions prepared in advance. Eleanor listened, nodded, and for the first time, I saw in her eyes not pity, but a cold recognition. The conflict within me was no longer simply about right or wrong. It became a question of identity. If I learned to operate within this system, would I be betraying the person I once believed myself to be? I thought of my father, of lessons about honor and responsibility. I thought of the version of myself on the first day standing before the Capitol. The distance between those two people made me uneasy. But I also understood that if I did not change, I would be eliminated entirely, and all my beliefs would become meaningless. I began to act in a new way. I no longer offered opinions directly. Instead, I asked questions. I listened more than I spoke. I remembered who owed whom a favor, who depended on whom for information to flow. I did not use what I knew to create conflict. I held it back, like a form of currency not yet spent. With each passing day, I felt I understood more clearly the map of power that I had previously only seen on the surface. The climax of that transformation came when I obtained an important piece of information, a small detail capable of slowing down an entire major decision. By old habit, I would have reported it immediately, treated it as a duty. This time I stopped. I considered. I did not lie. I simply did not speak. In that moment, I realized that power does not lie only in revealing the truth, but also in controlling when it appears. The feeling afterward was not victory. It was a mixture of fear and control. I was afraid because I knew I had crossed another boundary. But I also felt a new steadiness, as if I were no longer standing precariously on the edge. No one noticed what I had done. No one looked at me differently. But I knew that from that moment on, the relationship between me and the system had changed. I continued my work with the same outward appearance. I still completed my duties, still maintained a neutral demeanor. But inside, I was no longer someone who merely reacted to events. I began to anticipate. I saw small moves leading to large outcomes. I understood that I did not need to stand at the center to have influence. Sometimes, standing at the edge allowed me to see the whole picture more clearly than anyone else. When I left the building on a quiet evening, the lights shining on the familiar stone steps, I realized that I had not changed overnight. Naivety had not disappeared completely, but it had been wrapped in understanding. I no longer believed that being a good person was enough, but I had not yet become what I once despised. I was somewhere between those two states, learning how to survive. And in that very process of learning, I began to understand that if I wanted to continue this game, I had to know when to speak and when to remain silent with intention. I once thought power came from being heard. But when I was no longer invited to speak, I began to understand where real power truly comes from. It comes from silence at the right moment, from letting others wonder what you are thinking. When I no longer appeared at the center of meetings, I realized that the most important decisions were often formed beforehand, in brief conversations, private dinners, hallways where no minutes were ever recorded. The setting around me gradually expanded in ways I had not expected. I was assigned small tasks related to connecting information between offices, duties I once considered purely administrative. Yet those very tasks brought me closer to the people who truly managed the flow of power. I began attending informal gatherings in Georgetown, where senior aides, strategic lawyers, and backstage advisors spoke casually, as if discussing the weather, while in reality, they were shaping the direction of entire pieces of legislation. New faces entered my field of vision, people who never appeared in the news, yet whose names were whispered with caution. I listened more than I spoke. I made no commitments. I simply remembered. Marcus Reed began to look at me differently. He realized that I no longer tried to force my way into debates as before. My silence made it impossible for him to determine where I stood, and that unsettled him. The conflict now was no longer between me and the system, but between me and my own old habits. Every time I felt the urge to speak up and correct something, I remembered the times my voice had been ignored. I asked myself whether remaining silent made me complicit. Then I understood that my silence was no longer submission. It was strategy. I had not abandoned my ideals. I had simply stopped throwing them against walls that never responded. I began to use information more carefully. I did not provide everything I knew. I let pieces surface gradually, enough for others to recognize the value of my presence, but not enough for them to control me. I realized that when you possess something others need, time becomes your ally. You do not have to threaten, you only have to wait. The climax of this phase came during a meeting that seemingly had nothing to do with me. An important decision stalled, not because of argument, but because of a missing small detail in the chain of information. I had that detail. I sat still, listening to speculation and misguided assumptions being voiced. No one asked me directly, but I felt their eyes begin to turn toward me, waiting. When I finally spoke, not to deliver a complete answer, but merely to confirm part of the truth, the rhythm of the room immediately shifted. After the meeting, no one publicly thanked me, but the way they spoke to me was different. I was no longer someone to be overlooked. I became a variable that had to be considered. That feeling did not bring satisfaction. It brought clarity. I understood that I had stepped into a new position, unofficial, yet real in the way people reacted. I returned to my desk, looked around the familiar office, and realized that I no longer craved recognition as I once had. I did not need a new title or praise. What I needed was room to move, to choose when to advance and when to stop. I began to understand that in politics, the most dangerous person is not the one who speaks the loudest, but the one who makes others wait for his answer. When I left the building at the end of the day, the afternoon sunlight stretching across the stone steps, I felt clearly that I had changed. Not into someone cold, but into someone restrained. I no longer chased visibility. I began to let others wonder about me. And in that waiting, I realized that power does not always need to appear. Sometimes, it only needs to be felt. I realized the change not when people began to praise me, but when they began to need me. There were no formal invitations, no official announcements, just calls coming later than usual, brief messages asking for private opinions, and meetings where my name unexpectedly appeared on the attendance list. I was no longer ignored, but I was not yet the center either. I stood in a new position where my presence began to carry weight. The atmosphere now felt different. Meeting rooms grew quieter when I entered, not out of respect, but out of calculation. I realized that people were trying to guess what I knew and how far I was willing to speak. Discussions moved more slowly, more cautiously. I could clearly feel the thin tension hanging in the air, as if a single small detail could shift the direction of the entire conversation. Thomas Caldwell was the first to approach me directly. He did not revisit the past, did not apologize, did not explain. He simply said that there were matters that needed to be handled carefully, and that he believed I could help. His tone was calm, but I heard a clear adjustment within it. The man who once had no need for me was now considering me a necessary factor. I listened, nodded, but made no commitment. I understood that my lack of response was, in itself, an answer. Marcus Reed, on the other hand, could not hide his discomfort. He began making small mistakes, details overlooked in presentations he had once controlled with ease. I recognized the pressure affecting him in the same way it had once affected me. But this time, I was not the one being cornered. I observed, took note, and did not intervene. The conflict within me became more subtle. I was no longer torn between speaking and staying silent, but between intervening and letting events unfold. I knew that a timely remark could prevent Marcus's mistake, but I also understood that doing so would return control to him. I did not want revenge. I simply did not want to keep saving people who had once been willing to let me sink. The situation reached its climax during a critical meeting where a strategic error was exposed. Marcus presented a proposal based on assumptions that were no longer accurate. I recognized it immediately. I knew that if the plan passed, the consequences would be significant. But I did not speak. I waited. Questions began to arise from others. Marcus's gaze wavered. He searched for support, but I remained silent. Eventually, the mistake could no longer be concealed. When the meeting ended, no one publicly criticized Marcus, but everyone understood that his position had weakened. I left the room with a feeling that was heavy yet clear. I felt no satisfaction. I felt no regret. I simply realized that I had just witnessed a reversal of power occur naturally, without requiring any direct action from me. After that, the way people spoke to me changed once again. I was asked for input earlier. Drafts were sent to me before being finalized. I did not demand this. It happened on its own. I understood that the system does not reward kindness, but it responds quickly to necessity. When you become something that cannot be ignored, you do not need to claim your place. I returned to my office at the end of the day, sat down, and let everything settle. I thought about the boundary I was standing on. I had not destroyed anyone, had not overthrown anyone. I had simply stopped standing between them and the consequences of their own choices. And in that deliberate withdrawal, I understood that I had entered a different stage. No longer the one pushed aside, but not yet fully the manipulator. I was in between, where power does not need to be declared, only acknowledged. I realized the question had changed on an ordinary morning. No one asked me anymore what was right, or which option was most reasonable from a moral standpoint. Instead, they asked which side I was on. The question was not asked directly, but hidden in tone, in the hesitation before they spoke, in the way they waited for my reaction before continuing. I understood that from that moment on, I was no longer seen as someone who offered opinions, but as someone who could tip the balance. The atmosphere at this point was more tense than ever. A major decision was approaching, involving overlapping interests and pressure from the media. Meetings followed one another, long and filled with heavy silences. I could feel the fatigue spreading through the hallways, not because of the workload, but because everyone knew this choice would carry long-term consequences. In that environment, my silence became an element others treated with caution. I saw Eleanor Wright look at me differently. It was no longer an evaluative or testing gaze, but a recognition that I had entered the same tier as her. We exchanged fewer words than before, but each carried weight. Thomas Caldwell began to depend on my response, even though he would never acknowledge it. I realized that real power does not lie in giving orders, but in becoming a point of reference others are forced to consider. The internal conflict at this stage became sharper. I could see clearly the path I was on, and I could not deceive myself into believing it was harmless. I remembered the version of myself from the early days, the one who believed doing the right thing was enough. I wondered whether that person would despise who I had become. But I also knew that if I returned to being that person, I would lose the ability to protect anything I had once believed in. I began choosing sides not based on personal loyalty, but on the balance of power. I did not give my support to promises, but to structures that could withstand pressure. I knew that any choice would disappoint someone. But I was no longer seeking approval. I was seeking stability within a system that was inherently unstable. The climax arrived at the decisive moment, when all eyes turned toward me, even though no one spoke my name. I said a short sentence, not a speech, just a confirmation. But that sentence was enough to steer the discussion in a different direction. I felt the shift in the room almost instantly. Arguments were adjusted, assumptions rearranged. The final decision passed exactly in the direction I had anticipated. Afterward, there were no congratulations. There was no public mark attached to my name. But I knew that everyone in that room understood what had just happened. I walked into the hallway with a strange sense of emptiness. I had reached the influence I once thought was the goal. But standing there, I realized that power carries a form of loneliness no one talks about. I no longer had many friends in this building. Only temporary alliances, handshakes based on interest, and eyes always ready to assess. I accepted that as part of reality. I no longer expected purity in relationships. I only expected clarity in motives. When the workday ended, I stood alone looking out at the city lights turning on. I knew I had crossed a threshold I could not return from. I was no longer an outsider, nor merely an observer. I had become part of the game I once doubted. And in that moment, I understood that this victory brought no joy, only responsibility. I had won by the rules of politics, but the cost was that I could no longer ask myself whether I was right or wrong, only whether I had chosen the right moment. I returned to the steps of the Capitol late one evening, when the crowds had thinned and the stone reflected only pale yellow light. The scene was not much different from the first day I stood here, but the feeling inside me had completely changed. I no longer felt pride or excitement. I only felt clarity. As if every illusion that once covered me had been stripped away, leaving a bare reality I was forced to face. Washington, D.C. at night carries a rare stillness. This city of power at last knows how to be silent. I stood there, watching sparse traffic pass by, and thought about the path I had taken. I did not come here to become a power player. I came with the desire to do good, to help create the change I believed was necessary. But politics is not built to support such pure intentions. It tests, erodes, and forces you to adapt or be eliminated. I thought of my father, of the lessons he taught me when I was young. He said there are values that should not be bargained away, no matter the cost. Throughout this journey, the question that haunted me was not whether I had lost those values, but how I had preserved them. I no longer stood on the front line to defend them with words. I had learned to defend them with position, with an understanding of how the system operates. The final conflict within me was no longer between right and wrong, but between leaving and staying. I knew I could step away from this political world at any time, carrying its experiences and scars with me. But I also knew that if I left, the space I vacated would quickly be filled by those without my hesitation or ethical limits. That thought kept me here, not out of ambition, but out of responsibility. I made a personal decision that no one else knew about. It was not a grand action, not enough to become a headline, but it was enough to create a small change in how a future decision would be shaped. I did not announce it. I did not seek recognition. I did it only because I believed that, under the circumstances, it was the best way I could live with my choices. After that, everything returned to its familiar rhythm. Meetings continued. Deals were still negotiated. I remained within the system, no longer naive, but not entirely cold either. I learned to accept that I could not cleanse this political arena, but I could bend it slightly, enough to reduce some of the harm it caused. When I stepped off the final stair and onto the street, I felt a strange calm. I no longer struggled with the question of whether I was a good person. I understood that in this world, such a division is too simple. What mattered more was whether I had been swallowed by the system. And the answer, at least for now, was no. I was no longer the young man who believed politics was a place for the naive. But I had not become someone who mocked ideals either. I stood in that fragile space in between, where understanding comes with responsibility. If there is one thing I learned from this journey, it is that politics is not meant for the naive. But without those who were once naive entering and learning how to survive, it will never change, even by a small degree.